Good afternoon, everyone, or good evening, or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. And welcome to the People and Planet webinar series presented by the University of Minnesota's Institute on the Environment. It's exciting to have an audience and speakers with us from around the world today. I'm Todd Rubold with the University of Minnesota's Institute on the Environment and also NCEA. For those of you who don't know, the Institute on the Environment is leading the way toward a future where people and the environment prosper together. And NCEA, which is powered by and housed at the Institute, is a solutions-focused media outlet reporting on environmental issues all around the world. And you can learn more by visiting ensia.org. So why are we here today? Well, back in March, when the pandemic was in its early stages, we published a piece at NCEA in partnership with The Guardian that was written by John Vidal, one of today's speakers. That story, looking at connections between habitat loss and the wildlife trade and infectious diseases such as COVID-19, was read by over 2 million people and sparked a global conversation. So we wanted to bring John over for this conversation, or into this conversation, together with a group of experts to dig deeper into these issues. I'm thrilled to have an amazing group of guests with me here today. They're going to say a little bit more about themselves in a moment, but just to let you know, first we have Grace Gabriel. Grace is Regional Director in Asia for the International Fund for Animal Welfare, or IFAW. So hi there, Grace.
Hi.
We also have Dominique Travis from the University of Minnesota's Department of Veterinary Population Medicine in the College of Veterinary Medicine. Dom is also a longtime fellow of the Institute on the Environment. So hello there, Dom. Good to see you again.
Hi, thanks for letting me be here.
And we have John Vidal. John, as I mentioned, is an international journalist, a frequent contributor to NCEA, and former environment editor at The Guardian. So welcome, John.
Thank you very much, Todd. Good to see you.
So welcome to all of you. Welcome to everyone who's joining us again online. A number of you have submitted really great questions beforehand, and we're going to get to as many of those as possible. If you have questions as we go along today, too, in the chat, in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen in Zoom, you should be able to ask questions, too. So with that, I want to jump into our conversation. But first, I just want to ask all of our speakers, before we go into your bios and your backgrounds, just curious, where are you in the world today, and how are you doing in the midst of this pandemic? So Grace, if you want to kick us off, that'd be great.
Sure, thank you. I'm on the East Coast of the US in Massachusetts, staying home like everybody else. Yes, thank you.
Terrific. And John, I know you're joining us from overseas, so where are you with us from?
I'm on the English-Welsh border. I mean, literally 100 yards over. And England has got different lockdown rules to Wales. So I'm stuck here. I'm not allowed out, and I'm very happy to do it.
That's a nice place to be stuck, though.
Good hills, good rivers.
Yeah. And Dom, you're in my neck of the woods here in St. Paul and Minneapolis area. Where are you at?
Yeah, so I'm on the east side of the Twin Cities, a little bit out in the woods, locked down, torturing 3 kids.
Well, good for you, too. Well, thank you all for taking the time to join us today. So as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about a really big, complex topic today, this whole issue of biodiversity loss, the wildlife trade, infectious diseases. So to help set the stage a little bit, I just want to ask each of you to just tell us a little bit about your background, your experiences working on and covering these issues. So Dom, I'll kick it back to you to get us started here. Oh, and Dom, you're muted, sorry.
Yes, sir. Trying to be polite, not working. So yeah, let's see, a background. I am trained in veterinary public health. So I became a veterinarian, then trained in public health. And I've spent the last 20 years working at the wildlife interface. So I'm a little bit master of none. I work in each of these areas. I spent 10 years at the Lincoln Park Zoo in Chicago, first in research, and then as vice president of conservation and science. I then moved here during the emerging pandemic threats program when I was kind of seconded to Uganda, where a lot of my work is in Africa, to work on behalf of this issue there. And then finally, for the last 8 years or so, I've been faculty at the University of Minnesota, working in the ecosystem health area.
Terrific, thank you. And Grace, you have a fascinating background too. Can you share a little bit about your background with us?
Sure. I'm trained in communications in the media. And I had an opportunity. Actually, I was working for a U.S. media, and I had an opportunity to go back to China to film an IFAW project. IFAW, International Fund for Animal Welfare, persuaded the Chinese government to release 9 bears that were in horrendous situations, farmed for their bile, into a sanctuary. So I went back to film the opening of the sanctuary. And that was a really awakening experience. Many of these bears have been in tiny cages with a catheter inserted into their stomach in order to extract bile for commercial use. And these bears have been, for several decades. And when they came out into the sanctuary for the first time, some of them had already forgotten the softness of the soil or the fragrance of the grass. And one of them was pacing back and forth on the concrete path. Every time he put his paw on the grass, it was like electrocuted, pull back. And that was the moment, I think, changed me from an observer to an activist. And I started IFAW's office in China over 20 years ago. And I lead IFAW's animal welfare and conservation campaigns with a focus on social behavior change to reduce both market supply and consumer demand for wildlife parts and products in Asia.
Terrific. And before I go to John, just one quick follow-up question, Grace. So IFAW, is the focus of the organization on ending the wildlife trade? Is that the main priority of your organization?
Actually, it's broader than that.
Okay.
IFAW, it's one of our main programs, but we are also working on habitat preservation and emergency situations to rescue individual animals.
Excellent. And John, we've been working together for years now. It's great to see you again on video here today. Can you tell us a little bit about your extensive background?
Well, I was born and raised in West Africa, in Ghana and Nigeria. And I came back to Britain and got into journalism. And I was with The Guardian for 30 years almost, mostly as environment editor, but always writing. And I think I've reported now from more than 100 countries. And it's very interesting how disease is not really on, or hasn't been on the environmental agenda very much. But I was thinking about it the other day, and really wherever I've been, disease has followed me. So whether it's in Africa or Latin America or Saudi or wherever it is, the disease is one of these great issues which nobody on the environment side has really been looking at very, very much. And increasingly, I see now the links between environmental destruction, which we see around the world, the deforestation, the road building, the massive urbanization which is going on, and the sort of diseases coming. So in a funny way, this whole pandemic issue is something which is of its time. It could not have happened 10 years ago. The debate which is happening now is absolutely fantastic. This is a debate we should have had, I think, about 10, 15 years ago. And hopefully out of this will come a much better thinking about what the environment means. And it's not just climate change. It means it's how people live and how we treat nature. And the two go together so well. It's very, very, it's fascinating now.
It does seem like this incredible moment in time to be talking about these issues and really shining a light on these issues. So I'm glad you're here, and I'm thankful for your reporting on these issues too, John. So thank you all for that introduction. As we were discussing in a pre-meeting we had before this call, it's probably important to kind of set the stage for, what do we know about the origins of this COVID-19 pandemic that's going on right now? And Grace, I'm going to throw this question to you over first, because you were making the point that it's really important that we get clarity around what do we mean by this term wet market. So could you kind of help us start off by explaining what does it mean when we hear wet market? And also kick it over to you for that.
Sure. Let's go back to last December, when China first recognized that there are patients, COVID-19 patients with links to a market in Wuhan. The market is called Wuhan Huanan Seafood Wholesale Market. And China closed that market on December 31st. And then in January 1st and January 12th, China CDC experts went to the market and collected environmental samples. They collected 585 environmental samples, out of which 33 were positive COVID-19 samples. And 31 of the 33 came from a western part of the market, which is a small section where wildlife trading concentrated. So in essence, wildlife trading was the cause of the pandemic. And since then, there have been a lot of noise about markets and wet markets. In fact, wet market is a very Western term. When the pandemic happened when China found that wildlife trade was the source, they immediately closed all wildlife markets. And then when some of these regular food markets have reopened, I heard people asking, why is China reopening the wet market? In fact, one of my staff in Beijing said she's vegetarian, and she said, why are people questioning that the market where I get food is reopened? In many parts of the world, these informal markets provide daily food, affordable food to millions of people. So that's why I feel we really need to make the distinction of informal market versus wildlife market.
That brings me to the next question I had for Dom, because we were also talking about the differences between formal, informal, and illegal when it comes to the wildlife trade. And I think it'd be important to get some clarity around those different terms. So Dom, can you explain a little bit this differentiation between formal, informal, and illegal in your mind, and how should we understand that?
Yeah, so it's most simply put, it's kind of on two scales: organized versus less organized, so formal versus informal. And when it intersects with legal versus illegal, it underpins the idea that there must be a law or a regulation to exist for it to be formal and then categorized into legal versus illegal. So most of this around the world, and there are many different estimates of quantification here, happens kind of informally, whether it is legal or illegal, because we haven't gotten to laws around a lot of this. So a quick case is we did a study with EcoHealth Alliance a few years ago, looking at 15 years of data of import into the United States. And of course, we wanted to get at the illegal wildlife trade, but all we had data on was the legal or declared wildlife trade. And that study alone showed that there were 11 billion with a B individual specimens and another 977 million kilograms of wildlife declared imported into the United States from 2000 to 2013.
It's a massive, massive number. I want to continue this part of our conversation by asking you all this next question. A few people have asked us recently, and got this question from a number of you online beforehand. Looking at the rest of the world, are there other locations that we should be paying attention to where there are other hotspots for the wildlife trade, or really there's this potential for future outbreaks, these future hotspots, if you will, where a pandemic might start? John, I'll start with you because you wrote a little bit about this in a recent piece for NC, but I'd love to hear all of your thoughts on this question. So where are those other hotspots or those locations we should be thinking about?
Well, as Dom knows very well, throughout Africa, the informal markets are key. Hundreds of millions of people depend absolutely on them every day. and it's very dangerous to mix them up with the illegal trade, which goes to, I don't know, sending tigers and poaching and stuff. Most of this is perfectly legal. Food is coming out of forests, coming out of trading centers, and it's not dangerous at all. The danger, I think, is that there'll be a knee-jerk reaction and that all of these informal markets are going to be banned. And that would put an awful lot of people in severe difficulties. But having said that, some of them in Lagos, which I know, in Kinshasa, which I know, in Ivory Coast and wherever else, they're pretty unhygienic. And they are, time bombs. And it could well be that you do get a crossover, a spillover from one animal to another, to humans and whatever. So far, not much has happened. I mean, I'm quite amazed that there aren't more epidemics in Africa, because you see the hygiene, and sometimes it's absolutely appalling. But that doesn't mean it's the same as the illegal trade, which is on a scale which is absolutely terrifying. And Dom has picked up immediately on how much comes out of the world to America. I mean, the pet trade alone is producing vast amounts of the illegal stuff. The hotspots are going to be everywhere. I mean, I'm sure we'll come on to the other ones, but where you get large quantities of people in very poor countries, you will have informal markets which are potentially very unhygienic, and therefore, there has to be better monitoring of them, definitely.
Dom and Grace, what are the other locations that are kind of on your radar that you're concerned about? Maybe Grace, I'll start with you, and then we'll go to Dom next.
Yeah, I just want to kind of add a little more on that legal and illegal. I think viruses certainly can't distinguish the market, legal or illegal. Viruses also don't make a distinction on the purpose of that trade, whether the trade is for food, for medicine, or for exotic pets. And also, wildlife trade in the entire process, from catching the animal from the wild to transporting to the market, it's bringing a variety of different species of wild animals into one location. And the cramped conditions, diseases, injuries, or the stress in captivity, reduce animals' immune system, making them shed viruses more easily. And then, of course, it's human activity doing the wildlife trade in this entire process. So that's why, my fear is it could happen anywhere where this activity is ongoing.
And we're going to talk in a moment too about the risks of these viruses jumping from domesticated animals. I'm going to save that for just a moment here. Dom, do you want to comment on this broader issue, though, of hotspots and where we should be paying attention?
So in an attempt to be concise, which I often fail at, so disease emergence is an overarching umbrella that includes all the mechanisms of that. When we talk about spillover, that's when we're kind of drilling down on the wildlife, right? So disease emergence happens because of natural and unnatural selection in many different ways. So speaking of spillover and this issue of wildlife, we tend to focus and narrow down on places of high biodiversity. So the idea is that not only do we have a great deal of differing types of animals, but we have differing microorganisms as well. And these tend to be in environments that are conducive to that as well. So the tropics, right? The tropical band of the world, biodiversity increases as you go toward the tropics. And that's both microbial, which we don't talk about as much, as well as megafauna and other biodiversity. So people are kind of drilling down on that as the places where these organisms live and have co-evolved with certain species for however long. And then the emergence or the spillover part of that then goes to our changing interface with that rich diversity of microbes and species that harbor them. And that interface is driven by a number of different things, but generally our choices on how we use land, natural resources, and food, right? And so that can be a local choice. It can be a global expansion of that choice. So locally you have markets Those are based on food security and the ecosystem services, or the things that people provide, or that nature provides people, like food or other things that have been mentioned here. But then we've got this scalability issue as well. So we've got these trade routes, these global trade routes, where these products, live or not, are transferred. And so that expansion, that connectivity, that globalization of this trade is one thing. Or we've got, and this is the case today, we didn't even need global wildlife trade networks. What we needed was a really good, clever, and I don't want to anthropomorphize virus. So a virus whose natural history took advantage of our connectedness in other ways for that expansion. So biodiversity hotspots are microbial and others, and then there are multiple routes of that expansion and that connectivity.
Excellent. I'm going to switch over now to the audience questions. We've got a lot of great questions from the audience already, and some more coming in online here too. First question comes from Susan in Minneapolis, and this was a question that a number of people had asked variations of, but I'm going to ask her question. She's wondering, how can we both respect cultures that consume animals that might carry these viruses, while at the same time preventing the spread happening in the future? So how can we both respect these cultures, consuming animals, respect perhaps even our own culture might be consuming some of these animals too, while preventing the spread at the same time? Grace, do you want to jump in first on that one?
Yeah, sure. I think quite a lot of times I'm thinking of the campaigns that I'm working on. The consumption of highly endangered species is no longer driven by culture. It's driven by commercial interest. It's a large scale industrialization of this wildlife trading chain. And it's I see the demand drivers for consumption of even species that previously may have used in traditional medicine, and the traditional Chinese medicine have already found alternatives for these ingredients, yet they are still being used and promoted under the disguise of culture or tradition, but they are really a minority group with commercial interest in wildlife trade.
Excellent. That's really helpful to understand. Dom and John, do you want to add anything to that too?
Can I just add?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
I don't know China so well, and Vietnam and whatever, but certainly in Africa, I mean, almost some of the megafauna is taken, of course, and you have the poaching, and it ends up in medicine in China or wherever it is. But most of the food, most of the animals which are taken from the forests are not endangered. They are very common. They deplete the forest. I agree completely. There is a biodiversity element there, but they're not dangerous. And they do provide food for tens of millions of people and hundreds of millions of people. And to replace that protein with farmed animals or whatever would be extremely difficult and would probably involve quite a lot of felling of forests to provide the pasture land and whatever. So it's not a simple thing. The culture of meat eating in large parts of Africa is to eat wild meat, and people prefer wild meat. They don't like the bland stuff which we in Europe or you in America, which we like. They want their meat, much stronger, and it's a cultural taste, and it's a link with their past, and it's very, very important. And I'm glad it was brought up. But realistically, we cannot, and I don't think we should be trying to stop that. Anything endangered, yes, of course, we should crack down on that immediately. But an awful lot of the wild food, which is taken from the forests and from the savannas, is not actually endangered at all. So we must respect the culture, at the same time, be very, very wary of people abusing it.
So Dom, you and I were talking too beforehand about, it's not, as John was just saying, it's not as simple as saying, well, just switch to chicken or switch to some meat alternative. It's not that straightforward. So I just want to get your thoughts on this question too, before we go to the next one from the audience.
Yeah, so I work under this brand of ecosystem health, or an outbreak of brands, planetary health, One Health, all these things. every one of them and all these lenses we look through are about systems and taking a systems approach to this. And I think we have siloed these disciplines and these activities for too long and not looked at the spider web where we focus on the strand and look at this as a system. So food systems include utilization of natural resources and wildlife. Sometimes they're commercial and huge in scale, other times they're subsistence in scale. And if we look at this and we work on kind of optimization, and there's lots of jargon and things here, between the different stakeholders, the different needs, and the different values and outcomes that we want, we can start to have this conversation maybe responsibly or respectfully. I was amazed, and not amazed in terms of the information, but Grace, I've never heard what you said put so well and so organized in terms of these kind of cultural context of the conversation and the commercialization at the same time. And I think we need to start understanding that context a lot better for this, because people will do this and diseases will happen. And so only by understanding that as a system can we think about how to manage and react to that.
We had another question just come in through the chat that's kind of along the lines of what we're discussing now, so I want to bring this question in. This person, I'm sorry I didn't catch their name, is wondering, is the concern we're talking about here with the spread of disease, zoonotic diseases, is it limited, is it all the wildlife trade or only the trade in live animals? So what about the trade in you know, dead animals, bushmeat, that kind of thing? Do we have the same concerns there as we do as in the trade in live animals? Maybe Dom, I'll start with you. I think you might be the expert on this topic.
I didn't know if you wanted to go technical food safety conversation. Yeah, so now we're talking about food safety, right? And when it's about an edible product, right? We could talk about the medicinal use and how it's processed. We can talk about the other uses, right? But we're talking about products and microbiology and food safety or risk in that way. And we know there are studies out there of pieces of bushmeat, so pieces of wild meat that are shipped that have been partially prepared, boiled, dried, etc., that they're still isolating things out of. So they're either finding the genetic remnants, and we don't know if that means real disease risk, or just evidence that it was there, versus the ability to grow it, which is scary, right? But we know that these things, especially in the food sector, are not necessarily deactivated completely, which does infer the risk exists.
A number of people have asked us if we can separate biodiversity loss and connections to potential spread of disease and the wildlife trade. In my mind, they're all just kind of commingled, though. I mean, you can't pull those things apart, can you really? I see, John, you're shaking your head. So you want to jump in and respond to this question?
It's a very, very big problem. And there is no, the problem I see now in Africa is that bushmeat is not just for the poor, which it used to be, it's now for the very rich. So if you go out to a dinner party in Lagos, you are quite likely to be offered some quite exotic animals. It's become a big thing in Kinshasa. It's a big thing in parts of South Africa and wherever else. So because as the forests are becoming empty, so the price of the wild meat, if you like, is going up, and therefore it is becoming out of the reach of the poor. So what was a staple for poor people is now becoming something quite exotic for the rich. Now, I mean, how do you sort that out? I mean, it's almost impossible. I think you've just got to be very, very careful about what is sold. So what animals are being sold? Are they on the IUCN's red data list? Are they endangered? Are they going to be exported? I mean, America and Europe are notoriously bad. We never check any of our meat imports to check what sort of meat it is. I mean, we haven't got a clue. The stuff coming into London, I'm absolutely certain, which is probably quite dangerous, and equally for America. I think we've just got to direct international aid to helping poor countries monitor and control biodiversity loss for food, especially. Much, much better than we are at the moment. At the moment, it's a free-for-all. Anyone can do just about anything they like.
John, I want to pick up on something you just mentioned and ask this question to Grace, because Cecilia is wondering something that kind of ties into what you were just saying. She's wondering about what role does status play in the eating of wild animals or the trade of wild animals. She goes on to say, my understanding is that most of this wildlife trade is not in response to poverty and starvation, but has more often become a matter of status. Grace, do you want to respond to that question from Cecilia?
Yes. She's very, very correct. Actually, we have been studying the drivers of the demand for endangered species. I'll use pangolins as an example. Pangolin, it has been suspected to be the intermediary host for the virus. And this species is so endangered now. All 8 species from Africa and Asia are listed on CITES Appendix 1. And pangolin consumption, yes, pangolin scale was used in medicine, but people would basically buy live pangolin for meat and hosting a dinner with exotic taste to use it to demonstrate wealth and demands demonstrate status. And also, we have found that gifting of endangered species to basically court business and political favor has been a main driver. So in essence, the trade of endangered species has become a corruption currency. And that's why maybe you remember when China's president came into office and he started an anti-corruption campaign. And one of the things he called for was the ban of shark fin consumption in state banquets. And that reduced the shark fin consumption by 80% in the next year. And we see the same thing with the elephant ivory. Ivory has become a status symbol and to demonstrate wealth. So when China banned ivory trade 2 years ago, we have seen enforcement up, penalties up, and we have seen ivory price and the trade volume drop. So in a way, we really need to combine policy. Conservation policy has every link with the social and political environment in a country, and so that's how we should address it in that way.
But Todd, can I just come in?
Yeah, sure.
Grace, thank you for saying that. It's very, very interesting. But in rural Africa, we're not talking about inner city Kinshasa or Lagos or wherever, but in rural Africa, most people depend for their protein on wild animals. Now, the danger is that the conservation bodies, who are very powerful in the West and perhaps in China as well, are going to ban the whole thing. And that will make a very serious dent in people's food security. And I fear, I know people in many countries, they depend on catching a bushmeat or whatever. It is no great harm to anyone. The danger is that a knee-jerk reaction to this COVID episode ends up with a global ban on all wild caught meat. And that, I think, would penalize the poor, obviously the rich as well, but mostly it would hurt the poor. And the conservation groups are now working in their hundreds together, IFOR amongst them, are being very disingenuous, I fear, by saying that we want a big global ban. They're very powerful, there's a lot of money at stake, a lot of politics at stake, but the danger is that you throw the baby out with the bathwater, that you hurt the very poorest.
Grace and Don, do you want to jump back into this?
And maybe just in response, I'm specifically talking about the China's ban. So currently, China actually and Vietnam have banned wildlife markets, and I feel that individual countries through this pandemic, I think they are coming to a realization that the role that they have played, the wildlife trade role have played in that social context, and I feel and it has generated huge public support. I remember in February when the virus was, the pandemic was only pretty much still in China, and there was a online survey in 10 days collected over 100,000 responses. It was in Chinese, so I assume response is all Chinese, and the response 95.6% support and strongly support China to ban wildlife trade, and that's why recently there have been public input comment period collecting public comment for changing China's wildlife protection law. And I remember I pick out one comment from a law enforcement officer who actually, he says, this industrialized wildlife farming or captive breeding for commercial trade, he highlighted how this trade provides laundering opportunities. He says, if without captive breeding farms of snakes, he was using snakes. Snakes are very difficult to breed, and he says, without farms, if poachers kill snakes in the wild, they catch the largest ones to sell to the market. But with the farms, poachers would kill juvenile or even catch the entire nest of eggs to sell to these farming operations. And then the farming operations, of course, buy them, they become the laundering mechanism for illegal trade. That's why I feel that China's, the momentum in China, whether it's translated into globally is another thing, but there's also another momentum in China is government start feeling that government agencies are so stovepiped. For those that work on conservation, only work on conservation. Those work on public health, only work on public health. So this pandemic is another awakening in terms of looking at this One Health approach in both preserving biodiversity health as well as preserving human health. So I just feel, I want to respond to your comment.
I'm going to jump to Dom in just a second. I just want to say just to our audience that I'm seeing your questions come in. We've got some really great questions about factory farming, potential outbreaks here in the US. So I'm going to get to those in just a minute. But Dom, let's have you jump into this discussion we're having right now.
I just kind of wanted to draw a circle around this conversation as the conversation that needs to be had. So I've spent 20 years doing building teams for risk assessments of spillover and infectious disease. And every one of those model ends up, the answer is almost every time low probability, high consequence event, right? Which means it's not that likely, but if it happens, it could be really bad. And we are living through a low probability, high consequence event that happened, right? So low probability things still happen. So every time this happens, Ebola, HIV, every time this happens, the disease drives the conversation. And what we need to do is flip this conversation to two things. In this case, food security. What role does wildlife play or the nature play in food security? And culture, and how do we make cultural decisions? And that's not to say blame or excuse via culture, but culture is that thing that surrounds how the politics, how the trade, how the economics, how that happens. And if we can flip that and start thinking about that view on it long term, then we get to disease as unattended a consequence of these choices, which is where it really is. The problem is when an emergency happens, we start to find band-aids for that piece of the emergency. When it's over, we no longer have the bigger conversation. So I think this is the conversation that needs to happen in that sense.
I'm really glad that you made that point too, Dom, because I think that what we've been trying to do through our reporting at NCIA is really look at what are the root causes of this pandemic. How did we get here, and how do we then prevent the next one from happening by having this exact conversation that you're talking about? So thank you for drawing that circle and bringing it all together like that. I want to ask you a question that comes in from, I'm sorry about the pronunciation here, Anirban Datta Roy, and this is a question for John to start with. John, I was reading your recent article on 5 ways new diseases emerge, and one of the points involved factory farming and even intensive farming of wildlife. I feel this isn't getting a lot of attention. Knowing how integral a part of it's become to modern civilization, the farming I believe he's talking about, can we find alternatives to it, and what are the potentials for disease outbreaks in farm settings?
Well, thank you very much for bringing that up, because personally, I'm convinced that that's where the problems are, and we shouldn't ignore the factory farms, which, if you look at the list, if you look at the long, long list of Ebola and SARS and MERS and swine flu and bird flu and H1N1 and COVID, HIV, very, very few are actually to do with wildlife per se, and certainly with markets. Much more have got a connection with the with factory farming. So whether it's the fruit bats in Thailand, which are dropping the diseased fruit into the pig farms and producing diseases there, or camels in Saudi Arabia or wherever. There's animals were not necessarily meant to be farmed in the way which we are farming them. We are farming very badly, and increasingly, as Grace said, we are farming animals which were never farmed before. I mean, it's Vietnam. There was a big UN study and a couple of years ago, and they found that 173 different wild animals were being farmed. I mean, this is astonishing. And so, of course, things are going to go wrong. And I think this is the hot spot for me. Will be a factory farm somewhere which gets out of control, which gets hygiene is hopeless. If you speak to the vets in the International Livestock Institute in Nairobi or in London or wherever, they weren't expecting COVID-19. They weren't expecting a coronavirus. They were expecting a flu virus. And some of the flu ones, which may yet come out, are probably going to be worse than what we've seen so far. So I think factory farming has really got to step up to the plate and improve absolutely how it functions. And I don't think you can just substitute wild meat for factory farm meat. I mean, the scale at which you'd have to increase your factory farming, certainly in Africa, would be absolutely ginormous, and it would involve enormous deforestation or giant chicken farms or whatever. And things go wrong. When you put hundreds and thousands of animals together in a shed, that's when things go very, very wrong. And so it's not an easy one. It's a cultural issue. It's how do you combine the need for food, the need for protein, with very good management of animals. It's very difficult stuff.
Dom, what do you think about this issue of potential outbreaks originating in farm settings or wildlife farms, if we will, even?
Well, I'm a veterinarian, so to me, it's all about food in the end. And some of the veterinarians are laughing because they think I'm purely a wildlife guy. But it is about food. And we have to realize that our current food system, regardless of which part of it we're discussing, is a solution to a previous problem. And I won't say problem. I don't want to get into the population explosion Ehrlich conversation. But the way we do food is intentionally a solution to how do we provide enough food under the cultural choices that we've made in different contexts, right? And so if we think about food and sustainability of food, then we can address these comments and these conversations across the different types of farming, across the type of different species, right? So the escalation of wildlife in food production just follows 100 years late on the escalation of poultry for that. And those were all for a reason. The good news from a food safety perspective is when you do that intensively, you actually have the ability to create a system which you can control for safety, for production and safety. And that's called production medicine in our world. And that evolved for a reason, give us more safer food. But then there are unintended consequences of those choices that we have that are driving other mechanisms in that. So again, it's the system of these choices, the unintended consequences around these choices. And what we're seeing with the wildlife food part of that is that same kind of thing in a different context. And we have issues like this that shed light on that very quickly. So I think it's about re-envisioning how we think about food security again, with safety as a variable in that equation.
Excellent. I've got a question here from Emmanuel Ngumbi. Emmanuel is wondering, and I think this is a great question probably for John, for you, and for Grace. He's wondering, what role can the media play in helping stop the wildlife trade? Or what's the role, I guess, broadly in covering these issues? What's missing from coverage of this topic right now? So maybe Grace, I'll start with you and then we'll go to John next.
Well, I think getting to the source of this discussion that we're having is great. I feel that I have been actually in the last few months, I've been quite concerned to see that there hasn't been enough focus on the source of this pandemic, which is, you know, wildlife markets, wildlife trade. And sometimes people get sidetracked on for instance, on the wet market, perpetuating that concept or demonizing informal markets. Not only you're affecting the lives and livelihoods of millions of people, but you also kind of feeds racial prejudice and xenophobic fears. And what's more important, it deflects, it's a distraction for all of us to focus on wildlife, you know, wild animals. That's our relationship with wild animals. That's the fundamental thing that I hope that this pandemic will change.
I'm really glad you raised that point, Grace. Thank you. That resonates with me personally and professionally. So thank you for making that comment. John, what do you think about this? You've been in the media for most of your career. What needs to change, or what do we need to do differently?
Well, mea culpa. I'm guilty. I'm as charged, my lord. It's the debate about the environment has been very broad, very wide-ranging, very intense. Over the last 5-10 years, I have to say it's concentrated more and more on human activities, especially on climate change and things like that. And a huge amount of resources have gone into looking at the fossil fuel industry, looking at the history, looking at the science, looking at what's happening, and it's all, you know, it's good journalism. It's been very good, and we're on the brink, perhaps, of major change coming, perhaps because of this as well. That's another debate. There's been a separate debate about charismatic megafauna and what's happening to Africa's wildlife and what's happening to you know, and very beautiful documentaries have been made about declining biodiversity around the world, and that's been, again, very, very good journalism. What very few people have done is put the two together and do exactly what Dominic has said, and look at it from the food point of view. Look at it biodiversity from. I'm appalled at how bad the big international agencies have been. The World Health Organization has paid very little attention to this, I have to say. IPBES, the Great Biodiversity Analysis Group, again, hardly mentioned this at all. WHO, not very much. UK government, American government, not very much at all. In other words, it's been off the agenda. 10 years ago, there was a lot about pandemics and about SARS and things like that, but it didn't really hit the West. And now it has, and so suddenly the debate has changed. we need to have a rethink completely how we do journalism in these areas. I'm very glad to see it's beginning, but it takes a lot of resources to send people out there or to get Chinese. There are some very, very good Chinese and African writers and we need to ask them to be writing much better pieces for us because we don't know what's going on. And I think that an awful lot of very corrupt people and very powerful people have managed to get away with all kinds of stuff. So it's a great area for new journalism. But I have to say we have missed the boat on this one. And so I'm absolutely appalled at my own activities on this. I apologize.
Well, as someone who also works in environmental journalism, I have to say that I agree there's much, much more we could be doing. There was a recent study that came out last year, I believe, looking at mainstream media coverage of climate change here in the United States, showing that in major media outlets, it was less than 1% of coverage. And then if you look down the line at biodiversity loss or wildlife issues, they're pretty much non-existent. And so, I think there's a lot that all of us working in the media need to do to be elevating these issues quite a bit more. Dom, I'm going to flip this question around slightly for you and ask as an expert in this field, what do you think the media is getting wrong when covering these issues? What kind of coverage would you like to see that we're not seeing out there right now?
Yeah, thanks. So I think media coverage about the issue itself is important, right? It is an emergency of the day. And I don't want to discount that. But again, I would like the media to focus on the system and how we got there and where we can move solution-wise going forward. I think that this conversation we're having today represents the real issue versus the emergency tip of the spear kind of thing. People at I&E are used to me screaming. I think a conversation that has evolved over the last 20 or 30 years about Millennium Development Goals, Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, Millennium or Ecosystem Services is really important. I think they've resulted in the Sustainable Development Goals that we have, which are a partnership between pieces of this conversation. What we haven't done as explicitly an IPBES, which I can't unpack because I always get it wrong, right? In the biodiversity community is working on that now when you talk about ecosystem services for health, of which one piece, or supporting health, of which one piece is the infectious disease conversation. Another is nutrition and food and things like that. So I think we're getting there, but I think we need to keep our eye on the prize and focus on that and realize there's a lot of noise, but they're connected to that. And again, I'll just go systems on you, that system that we are building on a global scale. We just need to do it a little bit faster now, maybe.
So Diane asked a question, and a number of people have asked a variation of this question. We've been talking a lot about this issue from the perspective of what's been happening in Asia and in Africa. Diane and others have been wondering, she's specifically, I'll ask her question, then I'll ask the bigger question here too. Her question is, I live in rural Minnesota with a high white-tailed deer population. What's the relationship between the discussion of these diseases in other countries versus wildlife here in the US? She goes on to say, I've worked in East Africa for a number of years. I'm sensitive to the blaming for the developing world and blaming of other countries. But what's the potential for a disease outbreak like this happening here in North America or in Europe, where a number of our viewers are joining us from today? I'll just go with you, John, first. Yeah.
Well, in America, I gather, we're having it in UK, Lyme disease, which was not on the agenda only 10, 15, 20 years ago, is now a very serious issue. Ticks and the deer population have been shown to be inextricably linked, and a really horrible disease are coming out. As we have climate change, so we are getting warming. As you get warming, you're getting new movements, migrations of animals with diseases with them coming into new areas, and health systems which are not set up for them, whatever. We're seeing potential for malaria in southern Spain, in Italy, like there used to be, several hundred years ago. We eradicated it. We're coming back in. We're seeing in cities, we're seeing potential for cholera. We're seeing there's new potential for disease coming in at every point. So when we think with the only disease we've ever got rid of really is smallpox. and all the other ones are out there, and they're trying to get back in, and some probably will.
So I'm going to ask another, I'm actually going to go to Dom real quick, because I think you're an expert on this topic too, before I ask Grace another question that just came in online. So Dom,
I
do
would
you want to
also
weigh
like,
in?
I would be interested also in Grace's thought, if you can, on
Sure.
the last question with this as well, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. So Dom, do you want to start? Oh, go ahead,
Yeah,
Grace, sorry.
go ahead.
Yeah.
No, go. I'll defer to the vet.
Dom,
Oh,
do you want to jump in then first? Oh, sorry, Grace, go ahead. This is the
no,
wonder
no.
of Zoom, everyone.
I think I'll defer to all of you who probably studied more on the disease transmission, because this is not my area.
I would just say the risk is not zero. We deal with this all the time. There's a huge raging debate over chronic wasting disease in deer in northern Minnesota, and whether, like bovine spongiform encephalopathy or mad cow disease, whether this has potential risk to humans. This conversation is ongoing, and we need food safety and security discussions everywhere that there is a wildlife interface.
Excellent. I have a question here from Michelle. Michelle is wondering, and we're down to a few minutes left to go here. This might be our last question. Michelle is wondering, do you think this pandemic will move the needle in the world when it comes to biodiversity conservation and issues related to wildlife? Is this really a moment where things are going to change, or is this pandemic going to pass and we're going to be back here again in a few years? So who wants to kick us off with that?
Okay. I certainly hope so. You know, China was scheduled to host the Conservation for Biodiversity Convention this year, and now this convention is postponed. And this is a biodiversity super year, and I think this pandemic is already waking up a lot of governments to look at the interface between biodiversity health and human health. And I certainly hope that will happen. But I think more broadly, globally, I hope that the discussion is for all of the countries to be united. If there is a time for us to be united against the pandemic and looking forward how to prevent the next pandemic, this is the moment. And unfortunately, I fear that it's not happening. And this is something that I want to use this platform to urge all of the countries to put politics aside and to unite to move forward. That's the only hope.
Dom, what do you think? Is this a moment where we're going to see some change come out of this?
I can't add much to that except to say this is an opportunity to learn, and if we learn, we may change.
Mm-hmm.
And it is about people, and it is about global kind of systems within that and how we think, and we have to think differently. We have to learn.
And John, what are your thoughts?
Well, good points, Dom. Good point, Grace, indeed. I think we've got another problem, which is that conservation, the whole model of conservation is really based on the funding by tourism. And tourism is going to be hit very, very hard. The money is already beginning to dry up all over Africa, all over Asia, all over Latin America for conservation, because nobody's going to go. So we've got a major problem, perhaps, of extra poaching, of extra wildlife crime taking place. I think there's another thing is that biodiversity is getting back on the agenda. I mean, that is the wonderful thing about IPBES, this extraordinary body, is it really has shown that there are 1 million species which are at risk, I mean, serious risk. And governments are beginning to understand that. So I think the combination of a pandemic, of the best science which we've had recently, and much more public engagement through wildlife groups and others will bring change. I can't see how it's going to change, but it's definitely a time of change, and it's very, very exciting, but quite frightening as well.
Let's hope this is a moment of change. So I want to thank all of our everyone for tuning in today. I just want to say thank you for all the questions that you submitted. I'm sorry we couldn't get to more of them. There were some really great questions that came in, but I will say that we're going to use those questions to inform future webinars like this and also future content that we produce at NCEA. So definitely check that out and follow both the Institute on the Environment and NCEA if you haven't done so already. I want to say thank you to the Institute on the Environment here at the University of Minnesota for hosting today's conversation. We'll be sending out a recording of today's discussion if you weren't able to tune in for the whole thing, or if you want to share it with others, that would be fantastic. And then finally, I just want to say a really big thank you to all of our speakers today for taking the time and sharing your expertise and your passion for these issues. So thank you all for being a part of this discussion today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll see you all soon at the next webinar coming up pretty soon. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.